What's up, y'all? Roy here, and you're listening to the Clemenz with a Z podcast. Now, this is episode 2, and this was supposed to be the place. It's called Third Time's a Charm. Now, in this series, like I told you on the last one, this is about more of my story. You know, the whys, the hows, the things I've seen, things I've learned, stuff like that. You know, and one of the biggest questions that I get when I'm doing these interviews is, well, how did you leave? Because I spend all my time talking with other people about how they left this church. So that's what I'm going to talk about. My initial leaving. And, the title, Third Time's a Charm, isn't just a funny little saying. It took me 3 times to leave over the course of probably 15, or no, really most of my life. So this is that story. Now, there was this passage that I used to hear as a kid that always stuck with me, and not in a good way. It was read often in church, and it's Acts 2:41. I said, so those who accepted his message were baptized. And that day, about 3,000 people were added to them. Now, every time I would hear that, I would think, wow, that was easy. These people didn't have to jump through all these hoops. I'd sit there wondering, how did they get through all the studies in one day? Because in our church, baptism wasn't just a decision, it was a marathon, a grueling emotional process. And the hardest part, the studies. And I had made the decision as a teen to get baptized. It was at camp. And I wanted to do what was right. And in a lot of ways, it was out of fear of hell. It was also wanting to please my parents. It was pleasing the leaders. It was just a lot of things. And so, the decision in a lot of ways was effortless, right? But what baffled me the most as a kid was how effortless it seemed back then. In the Acts time, right after Jesus's death and crucifixion and resurrection and all that. It just seemed like it was acceptance and baptism in one day. Now, meanwhile, for me, it felt like a gauntlet. And I want to walk you through that a little bit. So, for those of you that don't know or weren't a part of this church, the quote unquote studies were a series of Bible lessons designed to prepare you for baptism, or at least that's how it was framed. In theory, it was about understanding your faith. In practice, it felt like it was more about breaking you down. And they always started with basic concepts, the word, kingdom, sin, repentance, but quickly it was turned into an interrogation of your entire life. And that was a sin study, specifically, and they wanted every detail. They wanted to make sure every impure thought, every mistake, every sin that you committed was confessed. But really, it wasn't about just confession, it was about full-on exposure. The idea that you needed to hit rock bottom before you were really ready to be baptized. And these studies were methodical. There was the word study, the cross study, the discipleship study, the sin and repentance study. There was light and dark, denominational study, and the final one was counting the cost. And that was the gatekeeper. That was the final exam. If you made it there, you were close, but not so much guaranteed. And while the studies were intense for everyone, being a kingdom kid, that added a whole other layer. It wasn't just about learning, it was about proving I wasn't coasting through faith just because of how I grew up. Now, what was a kingdom kid? Now, that was the name that we got for being born into the church. I had never known anything else, never been on the outside. And in a weird way, that made things harder. It felt like they didn't trust me because I had grown up in it. Like they thought I was too comfortable, too used to being around the church to really get it. Like they thought I was, I don't know. So they doubled down on me. like they had to scare the salvation into me. Being born into this should have been seen as a blessing, but it really felt like a burden. I wasn't just going through the studies, I was being put through the ringer. Now, the sin study was brutal. It wasn't in this one you confessed your sins, all of your sins. And if you want more information about these studies, there was an episode I did a long time ago about the studies. Um, but in this one, the sin study, you had to confess everything you did. If you lied, they want to know when, how often, and to whom. If you mentioned anything sexual, they would dig, pressing for specifics you didn't even want to think about, let alone say out loud. And there was this unspoken and sometimes spoken pressure to give them something juicy. It was as if the more dramatic your sins were, the better you could be saved. And then they dropped the bomb. If you don't confess everything, your baptism won't count. God knows what you're hiding. If you're not fully honest, you're just fooling yourself and Him. And that freaked me out. It made me second guess everything. I can remember preparing for that study. You had to write in a notebook all the sins that you committed, every last one. And it was like I was second guessing it all. Like, what if I forgot something? Did I really do that? Is there something I blocked out? And it was this fear. And the fear wasn't just about being honest, it was about being terrified that I'd get baptized and find out it didn't take because I didn't remember some sin from years ago. And then there was the cross study, and that one came with its own twisted expectation. You were supposed to cry. If you didn't cry, it meant you didn't get it, that you weren't truly convicted by what Jesus went through. And they would use something called the medical account of the cross, a document written by a doctor to describe in graphic medical detail what Jesus endured physically. The goal was to shock you, to make you feel every whip, every nail, and every breath of agony. And you'd hear stories of people sobbing during the study, completely broken by the vivid descriptions. I mean, who wouldn't, right? Well, I did. I sat there alone, hearing about how others had cried and wondering, why am I not crying? Am I heartless? Am I missing something? And it took me 2 or 3 times to do this cross study before I cried. And that feeling of being heartless and missing something was real. And the pressure to show emotion was overwhelming. If you cried, they took it as proof that you finally understood your sin and what you did to Jesus. If you didn't, well, then you clearly weren't ready. And I remember sitting there and feeling like I needed to force something, tears, guilt, anything to show them, these people, that I was taking this seriously. I prayed before each study that I would cry enough or show them enough that I was serious. Because it wasn't about how I felt. It was about proving that I was getting it in a way they could measure. So I finally cried, finally got through it. Third time. You're just going to see a theme here. And after that emotional roller coaster, I thought, surely this has to be the worst of it. But the final study, counting the cost, was a whole different beast. And again, I want to stress that this is when I was in my teens. I was 15 when I decided to do this. So I get to the counting the cost study, and I was pumped. I had done everything they asked, read my Bible, confessed every sin I could think of, cried during this cross study, tried so hard to be what they wanted. Remember that. I needed to show them what they wanted to see. So during that study, I just mentioned an argument I'd had with my mom earlier that day over a pair of shoes. It wasn't a huge fight, really, just normal teenage stuff. But when I brought it up, the entire room shifted. Everyone got quiet. The leaders looked at me, and he said this, something like this. Would a true disciple get upset over something like this? If you were ready to be baptized, would you really have gotten into an argument like that with your mom over shoes? They let me have it. There were words like prideful, ungrateful, not ready, thrown at me. And I cried uncontrollably, not out of some newfound conviction, but because I felt small, wrong, defective. I was thinking, if this is what it takes, then I guess I need to be better. And I left that study feeling like dirt, not inspired to change, not closer to God, just broken. So a few days pass, and I'm waiting to get picked up for a teen devotional, the cool Devo, the one that the kids deemed serious about their faith got it to go to. And I waited and I waited. Finally, the teen worker pulled up, but he didn't really open the door for me like he usually did. Instead, he just got out, walked over to me, and said, "We need to talk." And my stomach dropped. He told me that after discussing with the other leaders, they decided I wasn't taking the study seriously enough, and that I wasn't allowed to come to this Devo anymore. Now, in our church, in the teen ministry, if you were quote unquote serious, sold out, whatever, you got to go to this other devotional. And what it created was like it kind of created a class system to me. There were these kids that seemed to get it, and then there were all the other kids. And I could see there and watch what these kids looked like, how they were treated, the things they got to go on. And for me, a lot of it was about wanting to be included. And I wanted to be included in that. That was a driving force in a lot of what I was doing. I wanted to be included. I wanted to not be on the outside. I was an awkward kid. I didn't do or say all the things that all these quote unquote cool kids got to do and say, in high school. So I wanted that. I wanted to feel included. So this was a lot because I was in it. When I decided to study the Bible, I was in it. I was allowed to go to this devotional. I was allowed to be a part of this. People treated me differently. It was a big deal to study the Bible as a teenager. I loved it. I loved how my parents treated me, how people treated me, how friends treated me. It was awesome. But standing there in that moment, after that study, and after feeling like I need to be better and do better, I was just speechless. And for me, I thought, what more could I have done? I wasn't out partying. I wasn't out doing drugs or sneaking around or having sex with girls. I was 15. I was a kid. I was a kid who wanted to do the right thing, to belong, to be enough. But apparently growing up in the church meant that they had to push me harder. And the funny thing was, there were so many other Kingdom kids that were there in that cool group. And there were so many other kids that I saw that got treated a lot better than I did by the leaders. And I felt it, but I just pushed it away, right? In our church, you didn't talk to the leaders, you didn't talk to them about this stuff. You never did. But it wasn't enough that I wanted this. I had to prove it. For some reason, I had to prove it more than anyone else. I had to earn it more than anyone else. I had to be broken enough more than anyone else to deserve it. So being cut from that devotional was the breaking point. I stopped trying so hard. I stopped waking up early to read the Bible, stopped pushing myself to be a part of this crowd. And the worst part was no one really checked on me. No teen worker, no leader, nobody. I went from being a project to invisible. I was just gone. I was persona non grata. I was damaged goods. And being cut off really wasn't a scheduling change. It was a shift in how I saw myself in that community. So that's when I realized I needed to figure things out for myself, even if it meant having some hard conversations at home. So I knew I couldn't do it anymore. It felt like suffocating, but I had to tell my parents. Telling my parents, that was terrifying. The church was our life. I didn't want to disappoint my parents. I wanted them to be proud of me. But I sat down with my dad, bracing myself for the worst. But after I told him, he surprised me. He listened. He said, "This is your journey. I can't make this decision for you." There was disappointment in his eyes for sure, but there was also understanding. My mom, on the other hand, was largely absent for these conversations. For some reason, it was always my dad who handled the talks about God, life, and the heavy stuff. My relationship with my mom during this time felt distant. We didn't have those deep conversations. I mean, she was there, supportive in her own way, but not really involved. And one thing I can't stress enough about this, I can't stress enough, is that nothing about my parents' love for me changed during this time. They didn't pull away or treat me differently. They gave me space to figure things out on my own, and I will forever be grateful for that. Not everyone gets that kind of grace. But there was a catch. My dad said, "You don't have to keep studying or go to the teen devotionals, but until you're 18, you have to go to church." And I kind of understood. They weren't being unreasonable or oppressive. Honestly, they handled it pretty chill. I agreed. I wanted to be a good kid, and I knew I was close to turning 18 anyway. So every Sunday I fell into a routine. No alarm clock. I'd sleep until the last possible second, roll out of bed, get out the door in 15 minutes. In the car, I'd climb to the back of the van and sleep the entire ride to church. Once there, I'd link up with two other kids who didn't want to be there either, and we had this interesting tradition. We would always find the vending machines in whatever hotel or conference center the church was meeting in that week. We'd plant ourselves in the back row. And you know what? Those Sundays weren't all bad. Hanging out with those guys, just existing without pressure, was kind of a relief. As long as we weren't being loud or disruptive, we could just be. And walking away was scary, and I had been told that leaving meant turning my back on God, that I was choosing hell, but the weight of staying, constant feeling of not being enough, that felt heavier than fear. And honestly, stepping away brought a freedom I didn't know I needed, even if I didn't know what the road ahead would lead me to. And it was funny. Thing about all this was how little I fought for myself. I believed everything these people said. If the leaders thought I wasn't good enough, then they must know more than me, right? I was taught that challenging them was prideful. And looking back, it's wild how they treated kids who just wanted to do the right thing. You'd think a teenager trying to love God would be enough, but not here. And I started to believe that if I wasn't good enough for them, I wasn't good enough for God either. And I still remember when that teen worker told me to wait while he talked to my dad. I have no idea what was said between them. No one really told me. But when he came back, he led me into the room where the other kids were meeting, the other devotional. Walking in, I just felt this wave of shame wash over me. Embarrassment burned in my chest. What did I do to deserve this? I wasn't doing drugs, having sex, trying to pull anyone away from the church. I was just a kid doing his best. But somehow that wasn't enough. And I talked about how the two classes of people, the serious and everyone else, just constantly reinforce that. And that for some reason, I just made up in my mind that salvation wasn't a club I could get into. Maybe if I did it, I'd barely scrape by. I could be a second-class citizen in God's kingdom. That's what I deserved, or so I thought. And these things just didn't stay in church. This mindset followed me into life. I started to believe I wasn't worthy of much, that I was just a small person who should stay out of the way. I constantly felt like I wasn't doing enough, like I was one misstep away from losing everything. I've been carrying that around for my entire life. Carrying it's hard in your 40s, but imagine carrying that around in your teens. It's fucking exhausting. But here's what happened after I left the church in the teens, when I quit studying all of that. Life was surprisingly good. Growing up, we were always told that leaving the church meant a life of misery. Bad friends, broken relationships, total disaster. But honestly, that wasn't my experience. In school, I got a little bit of attention, not a lot. I had a small group of friends, boys and girls, who genuinely thought I was a good guy. It was awesome and confusing. In church, there was always this pressure to do the work to measure up. At school with these people and these friends, the pressure just melted away. My junior and senior years, I got luckier. Maybe it was just my personality. I don't know, but this friend group was great. Most of them I met through marching band. They were supportive, caring, and nothing like what I had been warned about in church. These friends, they prove that wrong every day. Now, our group was mixed, like I said, girls and guys. I keep saying that, but that was another narrative that kept coming up. We were with, you know, boy and girl relationships were just weird. It was very segregated in that way. It was like they were afraid if we got together, boys and girls, that something would happen, sexually. Like we couldn't be trusted on our own. But in this group, with this mix of boys and girls, it was chill. It just felt like doing the right thing just sort of happened naturally. We would hang out together a lot without any weird agendas. Sometimes we'd be alone, nothing would happen. It was wild to realize that people could just be decent without needing a religious system to enforce morality. Even when my girlfriend, I'll tell you about that in a minute, broke up with me my senior year, my friends rallied around me. They supported me in ways I hadn't experienced from anyone in the church during that time. I felt more loved and accepted by them than I ever did within the congregation. And one experience with this group sticks out. It was a hard lesson of grace and forgiveness. Now, it's not my proudest moment, but I think it deserves to be told. So, one of my best friends was dating this girl for about a year. One night I was driving her home. I don't know why she was in my car. The details are fuzzy, but it was just the two of us. I don't know where she mentions something about having to make a bet, that she made a bet with the other girls that she'd kiss me one day, or something like it was either that or like she was the only guy in the friend group that she hadn't kissed. Details are fuzzy, but before I know it, I suggested we kissed. She agreed, and here I was, kissing my friend's girlfriend. I know. I know. It was terrible. Immediately afterward, the guilt hit me like a truck. I felt terrible. I knew I had to tell him, but I was scared and ashamed. I didn't want to be alone or to lose a friend. A couple of guilt-ridden weeks passed by before I finally called him. I laid it all out to him, told him everything. I apologized profusely. The next day, we had jazz band practice early in the morning, and I was shocked when he still picked me up. I expected him to be furious, to cut me off completely. And yeah, he told me he was pissed. It sucked, that conversation. It's one of the worst I've ever been in that time. But he also said he appreciated my honesty and that we were still friends. We remained close for a few more years, even into college. That kind of forgiveness wasn't supposed to happen, at least not according to what I had been taught. In church, they warned us that people in the world wouldn't be loyal or forgiving. But here I was receiving grace from someone outside the walls of the church, experiencing love and acceptance I didn't think was possible. It was this wild realization people could be decent, sometimes more so without any religious strings attached. And I even got a girlfriend my senior year of high school. It felt like something out of a movie. It was awkward, exciting, easy. There was no fear of leading her into sin, no lectures about purity, just two kids talking in the hallways, hanging out, being teenagers. She even made me a mixtape. A mixtape, right? If you were a teen in the 90s, you know how monumental that was. Back then, you couldn't just pull up Spotify. Making a mixtape took effort. You'd sit by the radio for hours waiting for the right song or dub tracks from a CD onto a cassette. And she had done that for me. I was this awkward kid fresh out of this toxic church environment where I felt invisible. And suddenly someone saw me, cared about me. I'd never had that at church, at least not like this. Dating her was easy. In church, boys and girls were kept at arm's length. Not being, no being alone together, no dating in high school, constant warnings that our hormones would drag us straight to hell. Out here, I liked a girl, she liked me back. That was enough. No hoops to jump through, no leaders to get advice from, just connection. And telling my parents about her was nerve wracking for sure. I didn't know how that would go down, especially with how entrenched our family was in this church. I didn't know. Hmm. Here, their son leaves the studies, decides not to get baptized, and finds this Jezebel girl. What's going to happen to him? But my dad, to his credit, again, handled it better than I expected. He didn't freak out or lecture me, he just listened. He had boundaries and rules, but he still just listened. And I'll always be grateful for that. Looking back, I think that time outside of church, those little moments of freedom, showed me what life could be. No constant measuring up, no fear of being enough, just me figuring out who I was. And yeah, it was scary stepping away from what I had always known, but really, it was the first time in a long time that I felt like I could breathe. And it was surprisingly good, but sometimes freedom isn't always clarity. I thought I had left it all behind until something unexpected pulled me right back in. During this time, my little brothers were still in the teen ministry. So the teens didn't always meet with my parents' region. So I had the job of driving them. Sounds sucky, right? But honestly, it wasn't. I'd take them to whatever place they were meeting. I'd walk into the building like I was staying, then slip out claiming I needed to use the bathroom. From there, I'd just find some place to grab breakfast or take a nap in the car. I don't know if my brothers ever told my parents, but they rarely asked questions and I didn't offer any answers. But one of those Sundays, it didn't go as planned. So it was another morning where the teens were meeting somewhere else and the weather was terrible, rain coming down in sheets. I was tired, but still I was looking forward to having some time to myself. As we drove, we approached this infamous stretch of highway interchange in Atlanta called Spaghetti Junction. If you've never seen it, picture an aerial view of a tangled pile of spaghetti noodles. That's how it got its name. 5 major roads twist and weave over and under each other, with ramps looping in every direction. It's one of those places where if you're not paying attention, you'll end up completely lost or worse. Now, what makes this Spaghetti Junction so dangerous isn't just the complexity, it's the height. Some of the curved bridges are towering, elevated 40 to 50 feet above the ground, with nothing but thin guardrails separating you from open air. Below, not just grass or flat land, concrete roads, other highways, and speeding cars racing by underneath. It's the kind of place where a fall isn't just bad, it's catastrophic. And that morning with the rain pounding and the visibility low, I should have been more careful. I must have been going too fast for the wet roads. As I took one of the curved ramps high above everything, I experienced, I felt it. That terrifying moment when the car starts to hydroplane. If you've ever experienced it, you know what I mean. That instant when the steering wheel feels useless, like you're gliding on ice. I tried to steer, tried to correct, but nothing worked. The tires lost grip and the car spun. First, we slammed in the left wall. Bam! Glass shaking. Sound echoing like a gunshot. Then, as if in slow motion, we bounced off, sliding uncontrollably across the lane. The world outside blurred, gray skies, rain streaks, flashes of guardrail. We hit the opposing wall with a force that shook everything inside. And that impact jolted us upward, and for a split second, the car tilted. We were airborne. And so here's the thing. If we had hit the barrier just a little differently, if the angle had been off, we would have gone over. No exaggeration, 40 feet down, straight onto the concrete and traffic below, cars zooming beneath us, unaware of how close they came to witnessing a tragedy. We should have fallen. We should have died. When the car finally stopped, my hands were shaking on the wheel. My brothers were panicked, asking if we were okay, but my mind was stuck on what almost happened. I stepped out into the rain, heart pounding, legs weak, standing on that overpass. I looked down over the edge, just a few feet from where we crashed, and I looked. The drop seemed endless. My stomach twisted, and I kept thinking, how close did we just come to dying? The rain kept falling, soaking me, but I didn't care. I was frozen, staring at the spot where if things had gone differently, I wouldn't be standing there. None of us would. And right there in that moment, wet, scared, heart racing, I felt something crack open inside of me. I did something I hadn't done in a while. I prayed. I whispered, "Why did you save me? I haven't been living right. I've done everything to push you away. So why would you keep me around?" It was like a switch flipped. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to walk away from this and pretend it didn't happen. It felt like a wake up call. Like I was being told, this is your moment. Don't waste it. I thought God saved me for a reason. I needed to get serious about my life, about Him. Fear gripped me, not just of the accident, but of how easily my life could have ended without ever making things right. So it was there I decided to go back to church, re enter the Bible studies, and get baptized. I thought, this is it. I finally get it. This is the kind of moment people talk about, the one where you could have died, but didn't. You know, you would hear that all the time at church. Stories just like this. And I was ready, or at least I thought I was. Oh, and kind of a funny side note, I ended up getting a tattoo to commemorate that day. It's this silly little dragon that was a sticker on the car at the time. I had snapped a picture of it before the crash for no reason, and somehow it just stuck with me. Just one of those weird little things that feels like it matters, even if you can't quite explain why. And after I got baptized, things were okay, at least for a while. Found friends, settled into the routine, made it work, and I kind of thought this was supposed to be it. This is where things got better. And in some ways, they did. I had people to hang out with, things to do, a sense of belonging, or at least the illusion of it. But there was this, and it felt like there was this sense of stability, at least on the surface. A system like this have a way of pulling you back in, reminding you that you will never fully belong unless you fit the mold. The pressure to perform crept back in, shame and guilt, that ever-present feeling of not being enough started to resurface. I found myself at odds with so much of the teaching, feeling like no matter what I did, I wasn't really in. And one of those things that kind of highlighted the disconnect more was how the church reacted to something as simple as me going to concerts. It wasn't, I did an episode earlier about music and the power of it, you know, but it wasn't just these concerts though. I'd sit in church and hear things that just didn't add up. There were constant warnings about how terrible your life would be outside the church, how everything would fall apart if you've left. But that really wasn't my experience. My life outside the church wasn't that bad. In fact, I had good friends outside the church, people who treated me well, supported me, cared about me just as much, if not more, than some of these people inside. Sure, I had friends in the church, but you would always hear leaders talk about your best friends need to be in this room. And I'd hear that and I'd think, but why? I've had people in my life who proved that just wasn't true. And so there were these collection of things, these inconsistency, unspoken rules, these constant discipleship times where they would try to break you. It just started to pile up. I felt weird about it all. It was like I was seeing cracks in the system, but I didn't want to ask questions. I knew better. I knew what would happen if I spoke up. I would be twisted into me having a bad heart or lacking faith. So I just kept quiet, even if things didn't sit right. Now, I talked about how concerts were one of those things that highlighted the disconnect. And like I said in my other episode about music, it always been my escape, right? I loved concerts. They were the one place I could breathe, where joy didn't feel like something I had to earn. But the church never seemed to see it that way. So one time, there was the Dave Matthews Band concert. I had scored 6 row seats, me and 2 of my friends. Both of them were members of the church, just not in the campus ministry. Now, the catch was it was on a Wednesday night, midweek service. Knowing how things worked, I tried to be responsible. I handed my weekly contribution to a friend to give on my behalf. I thought that would cover me. I'm not skipping God, I told myself. It's just one service. But halfway through the concert, music pumping, crowd swaying, my phone buzzed. Voicemail. "Hey, where are you? We didn't see you at service." I shrugged it off. I had told my friend where I'd be. Then another call came in. Someone higher up this time, and I made the mistake of answering it. You need to leave the concert. I'll come pick you up and take you back to church." It was so shocking. The sheer audacity left me speechless. I politely declined. The concert was amazing. Then came Sunday. That's when the fallout hit. The leaders were waiting for me, their disappointment practically radiating. "You're not putting God first. You chose a concert over your spiritual family." I wanted to argue. I wasn't drinking. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I even gave my contribution. And I went with people from the church, but none of it mattered. The narrative was set. I had prioritized the world over the kingdom. Then another time, I organized a group to see these two bands, the Lost Prophets and Andrew WK, not on a Wednesday night. It was a wild, high energy show, moshing, jumping, singing at the top of our lungs. I even jumped on stage during one song at this show. It was pure, unfiltered joy. Now, one of the guys we brought wasn't a church member, and he actually pulled me aside afterward and said, "Man, it's cool that you guys have fun without drinking or doing anything stupid. You kind of showed me that you can party without all that." And that comment stuck with me. I was like, this is how you show people what faith can look like. I thought, live your life, love people, have fun. But back at church, there was a different story. Turns out one of the attendees mentioned the concert to a leader, specifically the name of the venue, the Cotton Club. Now, the Cotton Club was just the basement of the tabernacle. It wasn't a club, wasn't anything weird. It was just the basement. Smaller bands would show there. But that word, Cotton Club, raised eyebrows. I can remember being discipled after that. They were yelling at me saying, "You took a baby Christian to a club. What were you thinking?" Now, if you need to understand what a baby Christian is, that was someone who had just been baptized recently. So it was kind of like baby Christians deserve to have more attention, right? Like they couldn't handle the world or being alone with the Bible and with doing this mission. But nobody at any time ever asked what really happened. No one cared that the environment was safe or that we made a positive impact and impression on someone outside the church. It was about perception, optics over reality. And these kinds of experiences taught me something painful. Joy was only acceptable if it fit their definition. And my kind of joy, the kind I found in guitar riffs, sweaty crowds, and shared laughter, that wasn't it. It just felt like I never really fit the mold. No matter how much I tried, I was always on the outside. I wasn't fully rejected, but I was never fully embraced either. I got pushed to the back, not always blatantly, but in subtle ways that made it clear I wasn't in. And looking back now, being reprimanded for going to concerts as an adult seems absurd. I mean, really, getting in trouble for listening to live music, it was just another reminder that no matter how much I tried to conform, there was always something about me that would never fit. And now, while these experiences with judgment and pressure were piling up, I wasn't the only one noticing cracks in the system. And then came the letter that changed everything. So there's this thing that happened here in the ICOC that changed everything. You could say it was a spark that lit the whole thing on fire. In 2003, a guy named Henry Crete, who was a leader in the London church, wrote this letter that pretty much called out all the things people had been whispering about for years. The letter was titled Honest to God, and man, it hit hard. It laid out it all, talking about how controlling leadership was, how manipulative things had become, and how much guilt and fear were used to keep people in line. One of the biggest things he addressed was how leadership structure was built on this hierarchy that just didn't make sense anymore. Leaders weren't being questioned like ever. And that kind of unchecked power, yeah, it was being abused. There was this pressure to evangelize like your salvation depended on it because it kind of made it seem like it did. And he was like, hey, maybe we shouldn't, or maybe we should rethink making people feel like they're never doing enough. Great. And it talked about the financial stuff, people that were giving money, not really knowing where it was going. The letter put all that on blast too. The whole thing was like someone was finally saying the quiet part out loud. People had felt it, felt the pressure like me, the guilt like me, the manipulation like me. But here was this leader confirming it all in black and white. And it was wild how fast the letter spread. It was like everyone was passing it around, reading it, talking about it in hushed voices, in living rooms and coffee shops. It was this huge wake up call. Leaders stepped down, churches scrambled to figure out how to respond, and people, myself, started to ask, wait, was I crazy? Or was this really as messed up as I had thought? Henry's letter didn't just shake things up, it cracked the whole foundation. And after the letter, there was this sense that things were going to change for the better. I remember in our campus ministry, we had this one devotional after that that stuck with me. It was titled No Rules, Just Right. Yeah, like that Outback Steakhouse slogan. But this time, these church leaders were saying, look, we get it. Things have been way too demanding. We're done with all the rigid rules. We're trusting you to know what's right. Hearing that was incredible. For the first time, I felt like we had some breathing room. Like maybe, just maybe, this was going to be different. And for a time, and then it was like, every week, another leader was getting up to apologize, not just a sorry if you were offended kind of thing, but raw, real apologized. And after they did, they stepped down. I can remember a few times when leaders took me aside, even the ones that discipled me about going to the concert. I remember that one. He was like, that was stupid of me to say it. I knew nothing was going to happen. I'm really sorry that I treated you that way. Like that was amazing. Watching all of this, experiencing all of this was surreal, but as time went on, I felt freer. The pressure started to lift. It was the first time in a long time I didn't feel like I was constantly being measured or scrutinized. It was like I was finally having this hope that things could actually change, that the church I grew up in could be something healthier, something better. I felt hope for the first time in years, you know? For a while, they did. The pressure eased, the conversations felt more genuine. I started to believe in this new direction. But really, the systems are stubborn things. New leaders replaced old ones, and before long, the old patterns just crept back in. Our once unified church fractured into separate congregations. Churches popped up just miles apart, one predominantly white and affluent, another largely people of color. The unity we preached about seemed to crumble under the weight of unspoken divisions. And this was supposed to be the place. This is what I thought. This was supposed to be the place for truth, for grace, for belonging. And instead, it just became a mirror. It was reflecting the same flaws I thought we were above. Watching it unfold, I just found myself standing at yet another crossroads, wondering, if not here, then where? And I could do a whole episode on this, really, this letter, the fallout, what I saw. There's so much to unpack. But really, I want to focus on my story and the leaving and how all of this led me into hiding, because that's what it felt like. I had spent so much of my life under the weight of constant expectations. And then, just like that, the structure crumbled, you know? It was freedom, but it was also disorienting. I didn't know how to be, how to do, and I don't think a lot of us did either. There's this funny thing where our friends, you know, alcohol was one of those things you never did. You never drank. And I could remember getting with friends and trying to have a margarita and pina colada party. It sounds so silly, but we were like, finally, we can just have some drinks and hang out. Thing is, none of us had never made margaritas or pina coladas, and was way more tequila and rum than mix. And boy, it was terrible for all of us. It was like we had like missed out on all of these things that other people had experienced. Some ways it was great, yeah, sure, but really it was disorienting. It was weird. I didn't know how to be, how to do, or how to break this all down and figure this all out. And so, yeah, there was that strange sense of emptiness, didn't know how to function without the pressure to perform, right? And so I withdrew. I thought maybe if I lay low for a while, I can figure out what I really believe and what I actually want. But that turned into hiding. Um, from people, from church, from myself. I wasn't ready to face all the questions swirling around in my head. Questions like, if this wasn't right before, how do I know it's right now? Was everything I built my identity on, just smoke and mirrors. And I didn't know where to go or what to do. This was supposed to be the place where I'd find purpose, community, and truth. But watching all this, experiencing all this, watching how things went back to the way they were before it hit me, this place was acting like everywhere else. The same divisions, the same power struggles, just packaged differently. And it left me wondering where I truly belonged and if I had ever really been what I thought it was. And it was a weird time because, yeah, I could thrive in some ways. Things were chill, which gave me hope. Had some friends again, normalcy, but I was confused and hurt. And leadership didn't really know what to do with me either. I wasn't fitting into their categories. Wasn't I wasn't the rebel, but I wasn't the model of disciple either. I was happy, unhappy. I was unhappy. I was afraid to leave, and I believed that I couldn't. And this was the place. If I left again, well, what then? The fear was real. Fear of messing up my life, disappointing people, of what might happen outside the walls of the church. So I did what I felt like was my only option. I hid. And so, where my first time leaving in high school, this is technically my second leaving. I just didn't have the guts to actually leave like I needed to. So I was hiding. So where did I hide? I hid in the kids' ministry, the kids' kingdom, as they called it. So I would spend Sundays instead of being at church in the service, I was away from that. I was away from the leaders looking at me to pull me aside, the pressure that seemed to ooze out of every conversation. Just me and some kids. I loved working with them. I always had. Teaching was already the path I was on, so stepping into that space felt like stepping into a tiny pocket of peace amid the chaos. There were no intense Bible discussions, no one asking me if I confessed every sin, no pressure to raise my hands during worship or shout out to show I was convicted. It was just about showing up, being present, and helping kids feel safe and happy. And for the first time in a long while, Sundays became bearable, even enjoyable. I could focus on something outside of myself, away from the judgment and expectations. It wasn't perfect, but it was a reprieve. Then came something I didn't expect. I was accepted to be a full-time counselor at our summer camp. This wasn't just another volunteer gig. It was an opportunity to completely get away for a while. Being offered this position felt like a lifeline. I grew up going to this place, and it was the one place in all of this mess of the church and all of it, that I ever felt free and accepted for who I was. Now, this meant I was going to be a whole summer away from the world I was so frustrated with. But Sunday services, midweeks, no one hovering over me asking about spiritual help, just fresh air, cabins, lakes, dining hall with great food, and kids who wanted to have fun. And I was going to get paid for it. I mean, how could I say no? It was one of the few times I genuinely felt excited about something connected to the church. And what was great about camp, honestly, a lot. I could do another entire episode about this place. And so this thing of Kids Kingdom at Sundays and camp happened for about a couple of years. I kept getting lucky and they kept asking me back. And each summer being away felt like stepping into another universe. No phone buzzing, meetings, pressure to be something I wasn't. Working with kids was amazing. They brought an energy that was infectious. I found purpose in that space. I found a place where I could use my talents, where I could be creative and supportive, where I could just be there for someone else without all the baggage that seemed to follow me everywhere else. It was simple. It was pure. And for a while, that was enough. And then my experiences at camp then led me to serve in the teen ministry. And what that meant, what made that so great for me as well, is that I was leaving the campus ministry and just working with kids. I didn't have to be in the campus ministry with all of that. My purpose was serving some teens. And I thought if serving with the kids helped, like it did for me, maybe working with the teens will too. So I threw myself into it, hoping that focusing on someone other than myself would fix me. It was like how adults try to recapture the Christmas spirit by experiencing it through a child's eyes. I was searching for healing by immersing myself in helping others. I thought if I could be there for these teens, guide them, maybe I'd find clarity and peace along the way. But here's the thing, not working on yourself and expecting to be healed by working on someone else, it's a disaster waiting to happen. The longer I stayed in that role, the angrier I became. Frustration built up inside of me like a pot ready to boil over. I wasn't buying what I was selling anymore. I'd stand in front of these kids talking about faith, community, and purpose. All the while, my own belief in those things crumbled underneath me. I wasn't doing them any favors, and I sure as hell wasn't helping myself. And then there was what I saw while serving with the teens, the things that made my stomach turn. It was like deja vu, watching the same harmful patterns I experienced get passed down to these kids. The same pressure, the same guilt trips, the same emotional manipulation. Only this time it was being done to these kids. Teens trying to figure out who they were, getting weighed down with expectations that no young person should ever have to carry. I knew that all too well, and I didn't speak up. I didn't. Saw it happening, and I just stayed quiet. I didn't push back. I should have. I didn't. But I knew that speaking out would lead to conflict I wasn't ready to face. And I kind of laugh about this now. But during my entire time in the teen ministry, I don't think I baptized a single teen. Not one. I think that it was probably to do with my experience. I mean, no, that's what it was. How it was for me. I didn't want to be that teen worker putting that on them. I wanted to be someone else. I wanted to really see them and help them like I wanted to be seen and heard. And honestly, that should have been a sign. How could I lead someone to believe in something I was wrestling with myself? How could I ask them to buy into something that I wasn't sure I believed anymore? I wasn't giving my hurt a voice. I thought I could outrun it. Bury it under service, distraction, and good intentions. But hurt just doesn't disappear because you ignore it. It festers, and mine was screaming to be heard. Serving just gave me something to do, not something to heal. And when my personal life started to crumble, all those patched up feelings unraveled. So here we are, the third time, the third and final time I left. What did it? What made it for me? Why'd I do it? Honestly, it was a breakup. Yeah, I did eventually find a girlfriend. It was great for a while. But this breakup wasn't just any breakup, it was a messy, complicated, stretched out over a year and a half disaster. And I'm not going to dive in every detail of the hows and the whys, but the truth is, my world got blown up through it. This wasn't just some high school fling. This was my first real girlfriend, my first real love. I genuinely thought I was going to marry her. And when it all fell apart, everything else just unraveled with it. And it's funny how things like this happen that way, right? The personal, the messy. It can make you really question everything. So for the first time in my life, I started being brutally honest about what I needed. I looked around at how I was handling things, the church's way, God's way, and it wasn't helping. If anything, it was making things worse. All the advice, all the counseling, it felt like trying to slap a Bible verse on a broken bone. I needed space. I needed time. More importantly, I realized I needed to get away. I realized how I had to stop performing for everyone else and start figuring out on what I believed, what I felt. I needed to walk around in my own skin and decide how I was going to exist in this world without someone constantly telling me how to think or feel. There was a lifetime of hurt, a lifetime of shame, a lifetime of guilt with me. And no matter what I did within that system and within that system of thought, it wasn't getting fixed. Not there, not in this environment. And I decided to leave. And leaving was terrifying. This place, this church, these people had been my entire life. Walking away felt like stepping off a cliff with no idea if there was ground below. But I had to be honest with myself. I had to be true to myself. And as scary as it was, staying felt worse. It was scary as fuck, but it was the beginning of finally breathing again. And as I look back on all of it, the studies, the pressure, the breaking points, it all led me here to this realization, really. Because walking away wasn't the end. It wasn't the beginning of figuring out who I really was without someone else defining it for me. It wasn't clean, it wasn't easy, and it sure as hell wasn't quick. I'm still here dealing with it, still here processing it. It felt a lot like stepping into the wilderness, uncharted, lonely, and terrifying. But that's the funny thing about going through the wilderness by yourself. You get to see what you're truly made of. There's nowhere to hide out there. No voices telling you who you should be, just you, the quiet, and the uncomfortable truths you've spent years trying to outrun. And this was supposed to be the place where I found purpose, belonging, and peace. But instead, it became the place where I lost myself. And leaving wasn't about giving up, it was about giving myself the chance to find something better. And maybe that place just isn't a building or a group. Maybe it's found in quiet moments when you realize you don't need to be fixed, just accept it as you are. And I won't pretend like walking away solved everything. It didn't. There was still hurt. There's still hurt. There's still questions. Still that voice at the back of my head wondering if I made the right call. But I gained something I hadn't had in a long time. Space. Space to think, breathe, and to be. And in that wilderness, I started to see myself clearly. Flawed, hurting, real. And yeah, it took three tries. Well, two and a hiding. I'll call it. Yeah, but three. 3 rounds of convincing myself to stay, to fix it, to make it work. But in the end, walking away was the most honest thing I've ever done. Healing isn't linear. Growth isn't comfortable. But both are worth it. I'm still figuring it out, one step, one breath, one truth at a time. So, if you've made it this far with me and you're listening to this, and you're standing at the edge wondering what happens if you let go, just know this. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk. Sometimes leaving isn't quitting. Sometimes it's just the beginning. So thank you for tuning into this episode of Clemenz with a Z. Sharing my story about what it took for me to finally walk away wasn't easy. But if it resonates with you, if you've ever wrestled with leaving something that was supposed to be the place, I hope this brought you some clarity, validation, or at the very least, a reminder that you're not alone. If you are a member, were a member, or know someone who's a part of the ICOC or ICC or RCW and would like to share your journey in and out of the church, I'd love to hear from you. Together we can keep exploring this question. We were in a cult, and maybe in sharing these stories, we'll find some healing along the way. You can reach me at clemenswithaz@gmail.com or send me a DM on Instagram at the Clemenz with a Z podcast page. If this episode spoke to you, please consider leaving a rating or a review. You can like and subscribe as well. It really does help more people find these conversations. Just remember, just a channel, I ain't the source. And if you'd like to support the podcast financially, you can find the GoFundMe link in the show notes or over at the Clemenz with a Z Instagram page. So y'all, walking away can be scary. Trusting yourself can be terrifying, but it can also be the beginning of something honest. So next time, take care of yourself, stay grateful, and keep growing. Peace.